A Time to Plant, a Time to Reap by R. Chetwynd-Hayes. Arthur Cooper murdered his wife on Tuesday morning and buried her late on Wednesday evening. The reason for this undue delay was twofold. Firstly, the confusion that necessarily results from one's first murder, and secondly, the length of time it took him to dig her grave. He chose the site with great care. It was essential that the grave received the early morning sunlight, was sheltered from the east winds, and was reasonably dry, for it was Arthur's intention to plant some geraniums over Agatha, and experience had taught him that these estimable plants are rather particular where they raise their heads. The trouble began 2 feet down. Arthur struck chalk, and it cost him 8 hours hard digging before he had acquired a grave that was both respectable and safe. In the meantime, the reason for all this unaccustomed back-breaking work was lying face down on the bed, with her mouth open. Arthur had, of course, a motive for murdering Agatha. He did not like her. In fact, he had never liked her, but he had, quite early in their association, fallen head over heels in love with her money. It was, alas, an unrequited passion, for under Agatha's guidance the golden stream had avoided Arthur's hot little hands, and instead of reaping, he was expected to sow. A wife expects to be kept by her husband. This was one of her remarks. So it was, cheated out of what he considered to be his rightful dues, that Arthur found himself the sole possessor of 18 stone of feminine body, with the cool effrontery to demand its conjugal rights. Gone was the dream of a middle-aged housekeeper who dished out a fat monthly cheque and slept the sleep of the contented in her own bedroom. What about it, then? I fancies it tonight. Slender 30 looked at overflowing 55 and shuddered. You ought to be past that kind of thing, he muttered. Agatha thought this remark outrageously funny. She roared with laughter, her 3 chins shook, her enormous breasts heaved, and her great legs flailed like monstrous tree trunks as she fought to control her merriment. Past it? I'm just getting into me stride. I could break your back any day. Arthur thought it quite possible. Here, how'd you like to smack me bottom? He felt sick. Or play hide-and-seek between me boobs. So it can quite well be understood she had to go. She went. Arthur strangled her with a curtain cord, and Agatha displayed her unreasonable attitude to the very end. She took 15 minutes to die, and Arthur was limp as a dishcloth before the body allowed whatever life force Agatha possessed to depart. He buried her by moonlight. It was a dreadful task. She was too heavy to lift and had to be dragged, which strained his strength to the uttermost. Gravity helped. A push got her off the bed, and she flopped onto the floor with a nasty, soggy sound. Luckily, she landed on the bedside rug, and this served as a sledge, so he was able to drag her to the window. Getting her out of the window was another matter. She got wedged, and although Arthur put his back against the broad buttocks and heaved until his face assumed an interesting purple shade, there was no budging her. Finally, he fetched a spade, and by dint of leverage, easing a tiny fraction through at a time, he had at last the satisfaction of seeing Agatha go sliding over the window-sill, and hearing the squashy thud as she landed on the garden path. Agatha in life had not been a particularly pleasant sight. In death, her appearance was hair-raising. After her descent from the window, the face had assumed a lopsided expression. The nose was flattened, the tongue stuck out. One eye had parted company with its socket, and one hand, the right, was clenched, as though even now Agatha was considering taking vengeful action. Arthur ordered his stomach to be still, and considered the ways and means of conveying his worst half to her, it was to be hoped, last resting place. Dragging her up the garden path was out of the question. Carrying her, downright ridiculous. Then brain power came to his rescue again. The wheelbarrow. The trouble was, how the hell did he get her into it? The car-jack helped. The ironing board did serve as a lever, and presently she was enthroned in the wheelbarrow, the great legs stretched out in front, her grotesque head lolling down over the back, so that Arthur, when he stood in between the handles, was forced to look down upon a nightmare face that poked its tongue out and shifted its loose eye at every step. Now and again the clenched fist would strike the ground, and, in passing, even put paid to one of his prize dahlias, an act of vandalism that hardened his heart. He dumped her silently and unceremoniously into her grave. Although he had been considering saying a few appropriate words, not exactly a burial service, but something brief, like "'Tis a far better thing I do now," or "Sleep, sleep, and ne'er to wake," for Arthur did have a poetical streak, and was well read, assets which Agatha had never appreciated. She tumbled into her grave, and lay face uppermost, and Arthur lost no time in covering that disgusting face with its cheeky protruding tongue and wandering eyeball. The chalky soil that had been so hard to dig out went in easily enough, and presently the hole was filled, the earth beaten flat with a spade, then raked over, so that the 6-foot stretch of ground resembled the rest of the neatly tended garden. He planted the young geraniums with loving care, then, tired out, retired to bed. Now it is a well-known fact that a murder, like a good dinner, should be well planned. Arthur had not planned, well or otherwise. He had, so to speak, eaten his dinner, then set about composing the menu. When the early morning sun sent its first pale rays through the open window, Arthur woke and became aware of a nagging worry, a knotty problem his sleeping brain had been milling over during the dark hours. It took him a few minutes to realize what the problem was. How was he going to explain Agatha's disappearance? 18 stone of active woman was going to be missed, particularly as she always made a point of being either disagreeable or gushingly familiar. Quiet, well-behaved people are soon forgotten. Noisy, rude ones leave a deep track in their wake, a trail of resentment, which, if it is suddenly terminated, quickly turns into a question mark. But there was an even more terrible problem waiting to be solved. How was he going to lay his hands on all that lovely money? If only Agatha could have seen her way clear to die in a respectable manner, all would have been well. A will that Arthur had helped draw up diverted the golden stream into his own particular stretch of desert, but without a nice legal death certificate. It was just an interesting document with an unrealistic potential. After much thinking and the total destruction of a boiled egg, for Arthur did not allow business to interfere with his breakfast, one fact became crystal clear. Agatha should have met with a fatal accident. I ought to have thrown her over a cliff. He spoke the words aloud, then looked around with some trepidation, for had not someone remarked that walls have ears? He toyed with the idea of digging Agatha up and transporting her to the coast, where she could take a problem-solving leap over a cliff. But the prospect of a 20-mile journey with that lopsided and by now earth-daubed face was more than his nerves or stomach could endure, so he abandoned the plan for something more practical. Why not drive the car to the summit of a high cliff, leave a few bits and pieces of clothing around, and trust that the authorities would arrive at the right conclusion? But wait a minute, would they not expect to find a body, or at least a bit of body? I should have hacked an arm off or something, he reflected miserably, being as always wise after the event. Again there was a mental picture of him digging, chopping, but the prospect of carting a portion of Agatha to the coast was no more alluring than transporting her entire person. Then the darkness of his despair was hit by a brilliant thought. Why not park the car near a spot where the currents raced out to sea? He seemed to remember this had happened at Chalmouth, some 10 miles from Beachy Head. He threw a mixed selection of Agatha's clothes into a suitcase and started his long journey within the hour. A 30-miles-per-hour gale tore across the cliff top, and Arthur had to lie face downwards so as to see the boiling sea below. The scene was most rewarding. Waves crashed against rocks. They leapt and whirled in a most satisfactory manner, and really a better body disposer could not be imagined. Arthur crawled back to the car, took out Agatha's suitcase, and began to stack the clothes in a neat little pile, thereby hoping to create the impression she had disrobed before diving headfirst into the seething cauldron below. He vaguely remembered this was the usual procedure for watery suicides, but he had not taken the gale into consideration. With a triumphal scream, the wind seized Agatha's clothes, to wit, 3 blouses, 2 floral dresses, 6 extra-large bras, 4 nylon slips, and a pink corset, and, after raising them on high, bore them off in a southerly direction, not relaxing its grip until they were finally dispersed at various points along the French coast. However, Arthur was not left empty-handed. He managed to grab 1 pair of French frilly knickers, an article of underwear of which Agatha had been inordinately proud. Deciding that 1 pair of knickers in the hand was worth more than the entire wardrobe on the wind, he anchored them down with a large rock, aware then that this master plan had more holes than a sieve. He departed. He walked 10 miles, jumped onto a milk train without being seen, and 8 hours later unlocked his front door, stumbled up the stairs, and flopped, fully dressed, onto the bed. What with one thing and another, he had had a strenuous 36 hours. "Shouldn't worry, sir," said the station sergeant. "Shouldn't worry, but I am worrying," Arthur stated for the 3rd time. "She ought to have been back hours ago. Where can she be?" "Well," the sergeant shook his head, "you never can tell with the ladies, sir. My missus disappeared for an entire day once. It appears she got stuck in the tunnel of love at Battersea Fun Fair." "Well, I'm sure she's not there," Arthur said with great sincerity. "Well, sir, The sergeant was doing his best to comfort. "Don't be surprised if you find your good lady cooking the dinner when you get home." Arthur shuddered. Two gentlemen exhibiting a tasteful line in raincoats called the next morning, and although Arthur had been expecting their visit, he still all but fainted when he saw them walking up the garden path. They were very polite. "Good morning, sir," the elder one, the one with tired blue eyes and a grim smile, said. He raised his hat. "You are Mr. Cooper?" "Yes." Arthur swallowed. "What is it?" "Could we come in, Mr. Cooper?" They were soon seated in the lounge, and the elder man placed his hat on the floor. He eyed it several times, as though fearful lest it ran away. The silence was becoming painful when at last he broke in. "You reported a missing person?" "Yes," Arthur nodded. "My wife." "Quite." The man cleared his throat. "I'm Inspector Sharp. This is Sergeant Halliday." Arthur made a noise that could have been translated as, "How do you do?" and the two men grunted. "Your car registration number, would it be VGU 165? Arthur decided to say, "Oh," then racked his brains for something more appropriate, and only succeeded in producing a strangled, "Oh dear." "We will want you to come to the station." Sergeant Halliday apparently thought he should display some interest. "For an identification." "A body," Arthur gasped. "No, sir. A pair of ladies' undergarments, the only remains that were recovered." "Swift currents, you see, sir," Inspector Sharp pointed out. "Should the poor lady have met with an accident, well, she will be well out to sea by now. We must hope for the best. Was she depressed or anything?" Arthur couldn't imagine a depressed Agatha, and he was at heart a truthful man. He said no before he realized it. The inspector looked most distressed and scratched his head. "We have a theory, but I'd rather not disclose at the present time, if you don't mind, sir. There will be an inquest, of course, and we'd be obliged if you would attend." Arthur said, "Of course, and can I get you a cup of tea?" Both the inspector and the sergeant said that was most kind, and Arthur made a nice cup of tea, so they were all fortified before he went down to the police station to identify Agatha's frilly knickers. As no body had been found, Agatha's inquest was brief. "Inspector," the coroner said, peering over his spectacles, "what, in your opinion, based of course on your vast experience of such matters, took place on that cliff-top?" "Well, sir," the inspector replied, squaring his shoulders and assuming the expression of an expert lecturing to a class of laymen, "in my opinion, the poor lady had an urgent call from nature, so urgent, in fact, that action, craving the court's pardon, was demanded there and then. Having removed the garment, which was subsequently recovered, she chose a spot where the wind was blowing out to sea, and was blown or fell to her death." The coroner shook his head sadly. "I am sure this unfortunate, not to say tragic affair, will serve as a warning to those who might be tempted to adopt a similar course of action. I feel I can say nothing more than better a little late in this world than a lot too early in the next." He then expressed deep sympathy for the bereaved and sorrowing husband, and recorded a verdict of death by misadventure. When Arthur got home, he did a little dance of joy before racing down the garden path to acquaint Agatha with the good news. "You fat old faggot!" He would have kicked the grave, only the geraniums were coming through nicely. "Fat, stupid old cow! Misery! Bloody female Scrooge! Get down to hell and stay there! Rot! Rot! I'll find someone with class, a trim little number, you'll see." The geraniums nodded their heads, and the forget-me-nots stared up at the noonday sun with blue, innocent faces. while a fat earthworm slithered down through the black soil in its perpetual quest for nourishment. Next day, Arthur began to search for a replacement. He found it in a seaside cafe. It had all things needful for a really satisfactory replacement, having some vital measurements which Arthur correctly estimated to be 36, 24, 36. It was also equipped with a strawberry and cream complexion that made his mouth water, and a cascade of golden hair which caressed white shoulders that she had thoughtfully left bare. Arthur, with the boldness natural to a man who had recently laid hands on £250,000, sat down opposite this vision and smiled. The replacement glared. Arthur tried a direct approach. "What do you think of it?" He pointed to the door. The new sport-style Mercedes gleamed bright red in the afternoon sun. "Yours?" asked the replacement, in a voice which rang as sweetly as a well-oiled cash register. Her name was Clover Bryant, and she gave Arthur to understand that her one desire was to live in quiet, comfortable surroundings where she could develop her spiritual potential. Arthur stated how he, too, had a great regard for his spiritual well-being, and how lucky it was that they had met. She said, "I expect you're quite well off, having this fine car and all." Arthur casually mentioned a figure rather in excess of 250,000, and Clover agreed one could do a lot of spiritual developing with such a sum. They were married 3 weeks later and honeymooned on the Costa Brava, putting up at a hotel where fish and chip dinners were a speciality, and a tea laced with goat's milk had an exciting foreign flavour. They arrived back at the detached cottage, and Clover wrinkled her delicious little nose. "Rather on the small side. I mean, there isn't much room to spread one's potential. I should imagine a property developer would pay a nice price for it. All that garden, build a block of flats there, with an underground car park." Arthur winced. "Well, with a fairly small place, we'll have lots more money to spend. I mean, that necklace you wanted, and all those clothes." Clover, after some reflection, decided a country cottage was perhaps the place to expand her aura, for she was, after all, a simple girl who could wear a diamond necklace in rustic surroundings. Life became an erotic dream. "Would you like to—" she inquired. Arthur said he would, and he did. She looked at him, then down at her perfect breasts. "Perhaps," she suggested shyly. "It would pass the time," Arthur agreed, and he blessed the initiative that had enabled him to exchange a life of boredom for one of almost perpetual bliss. In the meantime, the geraniums on Agatha's grave had matured into fine, upstanding plants. Their red petals gleamed with good health, their rough stems were like solid stalks of green licorice, and their leaves were wide-spread hands, greedy for sunlight and rain. Arthur, when repletion allowed him time for mundane matters, took out his hoe and loosened the soil, uprooted the occasional weed, and rejoiced in his never-abating sense of well-being. Happiness is a form of madness that afflicts very few people, and then only for short periods. Arthur, when he discovered the white shoot nesting coyly among the vanguard of the forget-me-nots, had lived in a state of ecstasy for nigh on 2 months. He was overdue for a return to sanity. It was barely detectable, a mere fleck of whiteness, minute, tinged with yellow, shiny on one side. It was soft to the touch and bent easily. Arthur got down on his knees and examined this phenomena with mounting interest. What could it be? A sprouting potato? Hardly. He never planted vegetables near the flower beds. He loosened the soil, clawed it away so that an inch or more of the strange growth was revealed. A gentle breeze ruffled his hair. An earthworm slid up from the loose soil, and from the house came the voice of Clover calling, "Arthur, darling, where are you?" Somewhere, deep down in the dark recesses of Arthur's brain, a little man was shouting. He kept repeating the same words over and over again. "That's not a plant. That's a finger." There could be no possible doubt. Agatha was sprouting. Clover looked particularly fetching in a backless sunsuit when she crept up behind Arthur some 10 minutes later. "You do look funny," she said. Arthur did not bother to answer, only continued to beat the earth with his hoe, oblivious to the fatal effects suffered to his up-to-now prized geraniums. After a while, Clover became a little worried and ventured to touch her husband's arm. He instantly dropped the hoe and spun round, his face white and his eyes dilated by terror. "Keep away! Don't touch me!" "Arthur, what's the matter?" Her simple mind tasted his fear and sought for a rational explanation. "Was it something you saw in the garden?" He could only nod. "A worm? A nasty, long, wriggling worm?" Arthur shook his head. Words were still beyond the reach of his tongue. Not, Clover gasped. "Not a snake?" She took Arthur's silence to mean acquiescence and flung her arms about him while she pictured some long, hissing reptile slithering between the geraniums, armed with fangs and an unlimited supply of venom. "Did you kill it?" she whispered. I bashed it with me hoe." Arthur found his voice at last. "Bashed and bashed it. And you buried it?" Clover asked. "Yes," he nodded. "Buried it deep. It can't come up again. I pulverized it." "You are brave," Clover said admiringly. "I'd have run." "There's no point in running." Arthur unwound her arms and looked with deep concern at the ruined flower bed. "What's buried must be lived with." He did his best to forget, having sought desperately for an explanation. All phenomena can be explained if one thinks carefully. A finger must have come adrift. He seemed to remember that worms had buried entire cities, and therefore it was not beyond the realms of possibility that they could detach one finger and sort of uplift it. It was to be hoped that, having performed this prodigious feat, they, the worms, would let well alone and leave the remainder of Agatha below ground level. He decided to do something drastic. He uprooted all the geraniums and planted cabbages in their place. Cabbages were nice and solid. They put down deep roots, grew big green heads, and hid the black earth. Only Arthur was not at all certain he would ever be able to eat one. The trouble was, of course, that cabbages take a while to grow, and the naked soil, decorated by 2 rows of infant plants, looked almost forbidding. It was inclined to bulge in several places, and although the hoe soon levelled these, nevertheless imagination gave him no rest. Suppose something was pushing upwards. He steeled himself to push the hoe down below the soil. There was no resistance. He prodded the earth like a housewife testing a boiled potato. So far as could be judged, nothing was coming up. He decided to forget and even possibly forgive Agatha for her one lapse. After all, what was a finger, more or less? A floating digit. A stray index, a mere fragment. Come to think of it, the damn thing had probably come adrift when he tossed her into the hole. He went back to Clover with a light heart. Yesterday slid into tomorrow with the speed of an express train entering a tunnel. Days grew into weeks. Autumn loomed over the horizon. The summer began to die, and the cabbages reached adulthood. Fortified by confidence built by time, Arthur decided it was safe to leave the house unattended. They went for an extended motor tour, putting up at seaside hotels, prolonging a honeymoon that seemed fair set to last forever. They visited a certain cliff top. Was it here? Clover did not finish the question, and Arthur nodded. How awful! Clover gripped his arm as a seagull made a mournful cry, and for a moment it sounded like Agatha screaming for Arthur to come to bed. He shivered and drew his new, beautiful wife away. It all belongs to the past, he said. But suddenly he felt an urgent urge to go home. The cottage welcomed them. The setting sun highlighted the red brickwork, painting the uncut lawn silver gold, while the flowers gaily waved their bright heads, and the cabbages way down at the bottom of the garden seemed to nod a sedate greeting. How nice to be home. Clover had a mind that was well stocked with clichés. I always say the best part of going away is coming back. After tea, Arthur cleaned the car while Clover went for a walk in the garden. After a while, she came down the garden path, hugging a huge cabbage. Arthur looked up, then frowned. What are you going to do with that? Cut it up and boil it, she said with charming simplicity. I don't like cabbage. Then why did you plant them? There was really no answer to that, at least not one he cared to give, so he shrugged and went on polishing the car bonnet. I like geraniums best, Clover remarked after a short silence. But I suppose cabbages are more useful. After all, one can't eat geraniums. Arthur stated that, so far as he was aware, boiled geraniums were not recommended with roast pork. I knew someone who ate daffodils, Clover said thoughtfully. She boiled them in milk and added parsley. I expect they were very nice. Arthur grunted and set to work on the windscreen. Clover sighed and hugged the cabbage to her well-shaped bosom. One of them is deformed. One of what is deformed? The cabbages. Arthur applied windowline to the windscreen, then rubbed vigorously with a yellow duster. Probably got blight or something. I'll see to it later on. Clover sighed again. Yes, it's small and yellow. Beastly-looking thing. Nasty and soft, and it pongs rather. Looks like a clenched fist. Arthur's head came up. His mouth opened, and he made a strange sound. Fortunately, Clover had turned her back and was already walking back towards the house. She called back over one shoulder, Dinner will be ready in about 2 hours. The yellow duster floated unnoticed to the ground. Arthur felt sick. The blood drained from his face, and there was a terrible coldness. He wanted to walk slowly up the garden path and reassure himself all was well, that all he needed worry about was a cabbage that had been struck down in childhood. But he ran. He raced towards horror, dimly aware that it had sat on his shoulders for many a month and was now maturing into a hideous bloom. The cabbages were 3 rows of motionless green heads, glossy, one might say, replete with good living. One had a pinkish tinge. Arthur paused. Now there was a childish urge to turn about and run back, to keep running, to hide in a wood and never let anyone see his face again. Then common sense prevailed, and he knew the inevitable must be faced, whatever the consequences. It was there, yellow, shriveled like a rotten orange, but to the eye that knew, undoubtedly a clenched fist. The knuckle bones gleamed like old piano keys through the discoloured skin, and the fingers were tight shut in a gesture of terrible menace. Arthur swore, trapped in a fit of fear-inspired rage. "Damn the bloody fat cow! Do you hear me down there? Leave me alone! You're dead! 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 I'll settle your hash. Just wait! Just wait!" The fist waited while Arthur ran to the tool shed and returned with a spade. He raised it above his head, took one savage swipe, missed, and beheaded a cabbage. "Cool," he was speaking aloud. "Got to keep cool. Now take aim, and—" He swung the spade, hit the fist square on, and it rose in a graceful curve to land with a sickening thud some 20 feet away. It took time for Arthur to find it, for the grass had grown during his absence. Eventually, he almost trod on it. It was nestling down between 2 tufts of grass, and came up onto his spade like a fried egg onto a slice. Arthur's eyes saw, but for a while his brain refused to believe. The fist had roots. Long, thin, pinkish roots that bled slightly, suggesting they had been broken off from some longer, more substantial growth. He took the awful thing to a spot under the old elm tree and buried it deep, flattening the earth afterwards with the blade of his spade. Then he returned to the grave, no, the cabbage patch. He uprooted one big toe that was just beginning to put in a coy appearance, one little finger, a thumb, and a few more odds and ends that defied recognition. He buried these under the apple tree, spreading them out well, for he had a terrible vision of them continuing to produce some awful hybrid. "Dinner's ready," Clover said, some half an hour later. "What on earth are you doing?" Arthur did not answer. He was carrying a large piece of rock. "All those lovely cabbages!" Clover cried. "You've uprooted all the cabbages." "Bugger the cabbages," Arthur said coarsely. "But what are you doing with all those stones?" "Rockery." Arthur dumped a lump of masonry on top of a mounting pile of bricks, stones, and a couple of rusty flat irons he had found in the tool shed. "But—" Clover began, then gasped. "You mustn't lift that. It's far too heavy." Arthur shook his head. "Can't be too heavy. Nothing can be too heavy." "Well, come and have your dinner. It'll spoil." "Haven't got time." Arthur emptied a barrow-load of half-bricks onto the one-time cabbage patch. "Must finish before sunset. Must. Got to keep her down." "Keep who down? Eh?" Arthur dropped the barrow. Keep the soil down. It rises during the night, you know." "Does it?" Clover shook her head in bewilderment. "I didn't know that. You are clever. Wouldn't it be awful if it rose up and made all those stones tumble down? Then all your hard work would have been for nothing." Arthur groaned. He threw earth over the end result and planted forget-me-nots in all the nooks and crannies, so that within a few weeks it began to look quite pretty in a craggy sort of way. Unfortunately, sometimes, usually at sunset, if one stood in a certain part of the garden, the rockery did rather resemble a fat woman in a flowered dress. But Arthur was careful where he stood, and decided the garden did not look its best at eventide anyway. But when he lay beside Clover in the bed he had once shared with Agatha, he found himself listening. Was the rockery heavy enough? Could she not even now be worming her way up, dislodging a rock here, a stone there, slithering up like some hideous flower towards the light? Once, during those sleepless hours, he did hear a dull thud, and next morning found the solitary stone that had fallen from the rockery, but that was all, no sinister growth. Time began slowly to rebuild the wall of confidence. Then, one terrible day, Arthur stepped out into the narrow lane, and a young man in a bright sports car hit him square on. When he returned to consciousness, he was encased in bandages and plaster of Paris, and a distressed Clover was patting her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I thought—" She was sobbing so gently so as not to disturb her makeup. "I thought you were dead." Arthur wished he was. He was one continuous ache, and whenever he moved, a blast of pain shot up the entire length of his body. What's... Talking was also a painful business. "What's wrong with me?" Clover blew her nose, then hastily consulted a handbag mirror in case she had reddened it. "You have broken 2 of your darling legs, cracked 3 sweet ribs, fractured 1 divine arm, and you were bruised all over." "Bloody hell!" Arthur exclaimed. "I could kill that awful young man in the car," Clover declared, then added wistfully, "even if he was rather dishy. The doctor, who's rather nice, says you'll be laid up for weeks, even months." Arthur groaned. "Yes, I know, it's simply awful to think you'll be in this terrible hospital for ages, and I'll be on my own, no one to take care of me." She shook her head sadly. "I hope I'll be able to hold out. I mean to say, I am rather—" "The garden!" Arthur gasped. "Who's going to look after the garden?" "Don't you worry about the garden," Clover said cheerfully. "I'll get a man in. There's an awfully nice young chap in the village." "No!" Arthur tried to sit up, but instantly fell back with a muffled shriek. "Leave it alone! No one is to touch it, do you hear me? No one!" "Well," Clover permitted her face to assume a tiny frown, "well, if that's the way you feel, I'm sorry I said anything. The grass can grow a mile high as far as I'm concerned." "Good." Arthur tried to nod. "It can become a jungle, an impenetrable jungle." "Splendid!" Arthur felt like clapping. "I can get myself fit chopping it down, you see, once I'm on my feet again." He spent 4 weeks worrying in hospital, and Clover came to see him every Wednesday evening and Sunday afternoon. On the second Sunday, she was accompanied by the young man who was the direct cause of Arthur's predicament. He was tall and red-faced, and sported a ridiculous little moustache. "Sorry, old man, all my dashed fault, although you did sort of pop out from nowhere." "He kindly offered me a lift," Clover pronounced. "Thought I couldn't do less," the young man stated. "I mean, you laid up here, and your dear lady wife having to take the bally old bus." Arthur was concerned about a more important matter. "How's the garden?" "Dreadful." Clover shook her head. "The grass is all over the place, and you can scarcely see the rockery." "Oh dear," Arthur exclaimed with a sigh of relief. The young man cleared his throat. "Would you like me to run the old lawn-mower over it? Bash about with the old spade? Dig up the bits and pieces?" "No." Arthur tried to raise a fractured arm. "No, you're very kind." "Oh, no trouble," the young man insisted. "Pleasure, absolute pleasure." "He'll be company for me," Clover stated, wide-eyed. "After all, I've only got the goldfish." "Leave the bloody garden alone!" Arthur roared, and a ward sister gave him an anxious look. "No one is to touch the garden but me." "He has a thing about the garden," Clover said softly. She would have been angry, but someone had once told her that anger makes lines on the face. But I do want to help, most frightfully, the young man exclaimed. You can clean the windows, Clover suggested. The leaves had fallen when Arthur came home. The tall grass in the garden was dying. The trees were dark skeletons, standing out against a sullen sky, and the rockery was a weed-infested pile, waiting for winter. Arthur, still unable to walk, was forced to sit by the window and gaze down upon his neglected domain. The grass hid so much. Or did it? Conscience may make cowards of us all, and it can also make a fool out of a clever man. Arthur was not clever. He began to wonder if he had allowed his sense of guilt to play havoc with his imagination. What the hell was a finger or two, plus the odd fist? What would it amount to anyway? Surely, with that lot of bricks on top of her, Agatha was well and truly bedded down by now. Come spring, when he was fully active again, he would cut the grass, trim the rockery, and laugh at these ridiculous fears. Winter came. Snow fell. The garden became a vast plain of eye-dazzling whiteness, save for the rockery, which stood out like a fat woman in a white dress. Arthur chuckled and whispered aloud, "That'll keep you down, freeze your bones and chill your marrow, make that bloody tongue curl up. No more yap, yap, yap." Come Christmas, and he was able to walk about, assisted by 2 sticks, while Clover organized what she called a Yuletide festival. She bought a plastic Christmas tree and a string of colored lights, with an assortment of paper chains. She also invited for Christmas the young man with the sports car. "Gregory," she explained to Arthur, who was beginning to entertain some nasty suspicions, "was very helpful when you were in hospital. He's very lonely, and I think it only right we repay him for all his kindness." "Sure he hasn't been paid already?" Arthur inquired. "Well, now you're being horrid, absolutely horrid and unkind," she cried beautifully, without tears, and Arthur could do no less than beg her pardon, which she, after a suitable interval, freely gave. The Christmas day came, and Gregory was there, assisting in the kitchen, full of Arthur's whisky and good cheer. "Don't you move," he instructed Arthur. "The little woman and I can manage quite nicely." Arthur growled and insisted on coming into the kitchen, where he dropped a hot plate and spilt the gravy. "Go sit down," Clover said, and he knew they were laughing at him, basking in a warm glow of togetherness from which he was forever excluded. He sulked, knowing full well that this was not the way to treat the situation. "Feel a bit down in the mouth?" Gregory inquired, and Clover giggled. "I expect he wants to play in his garden." "Bit chilly out there, old man. Won't be able to put any more rocks on the rockery, or plant any more cabbages." Clover exploded into a fit of uncontrolled merriment. "Shut up!" Arthur heard his voice rise to a high-pitched shout, and he knew he looked and sounded ridiculous, but seemed to have lost control of his brain. It was making him speak and behave like a madman. "Temper, old boy," Gregory said softly. "Must keep the old shirt on, you know. Christmas, season of goodwill and all that." "Sod Christmas!" Arthur was shaking with infantile rage. "You think I'm blind? You think I'm a half-wit or something?" "Well, I'm sure you've got all your marbles," Gregory murmured. "I know you've been having it off with my wife." Arthur crashed his fist down on the Welsh dresser. "I bet she never stood upright all the time I was in hospital." "He's so coarse," Clover shuddered, and Gregory frowned. "I say, old man, that's a bit thick. I mean to say, in front of the lady and so forth. I really do think an apology is in order." "I'll see you damned first." Arthur kicked the dresser and looked longingly at an iron saucepan. "I'll tell you what, I'll repeat it all in court. Divorce court. I'll make Both of your names stink, you see if I don't. Oh, the Sunday papers will love this. Wife commits adultery with man who ran down husband in sports car. Can't let you do that, old man, Gregory said gently, taking up a large carving knife. Wouldn't do at all. You see, can't have our names linked. Besides, the poor girl wouldn't get a bean. A cold blast of terror extinguished the fire of Arthur's anger, and suddenly he wanted to cry, What do you mean? Afraid you're for the chop, old boy, Gregory said sadly, as he came round the kitchen table. Got the good lady's name to think about. Sorry and all that. You're mad! Arthur began to back away, and only succeeded in trapping himself between the dresser and the return wall. I mean, you can't! His poor, terror-stricken brain fought to discover a valid reason to postpone his approaching demise. Damn it all, it's Christmas Day! Gregory chuckled. Better the day, better the deed. He came close to Arthur, then drove the carving knife with careful precision between his second and third ribs. He stood back, as though to admire his work. Arthur made a strange gurgling sound, then, to Clover's horrified astonishment, staggered out from beside the dresser and advanced, stiff-legged, across the kitchen. The carving handle stood out from his chest like some hideous growth. His mouth opened, and a pinkish froth seeped over his lips. A few words bubbled up from his constricted throat. She should have been up by now. He swayed like an uprooted tree, then crashed to the floor. For a while there was silence. Then Clover spoke. What did he mean? Don't know. Must say he was a hard chap to kill. I was doing all of 40 miles an hour when I hit him with a car, and damn me if he isn't up and about within 3 months. Then I shove a ruddy great carving knife in his heart, and he goes belting about the place, chattering on like a sex-mad monkey. Gregory? Clover clutched his arm. I think he's still breathing. Is he? Gregory reached for another knife. We'll soon put paid to that. After a while, they began to discuss the disposal problem. This is not what we planned, darling, Clover complained. I know, old girl, but when he was so dashed rude to you, I blew my top. Sort of did the deed and left the planning bit to afterwards. Bad form, I know. Sorry. But Gregory, my sweet, where are we going to put him? Gregory scratched his head. Got me there. Always made the others look like accidents, you see. Safer, no problems. The jolly old authorities looked after the bodies for me. All I had to do was collect the doings. But, Gregory, darling, we've got to get rid of him. I mean, we can't leave him in the kitchen. And I'm afraid the authorities won't help, not without asking nasty questions anyway. You must think, darling. All right, if you say so. Gregory assumed an expression which suggested some sort of activity was taking place in his brain. Then he spoke. What about dumping him in the road? Accident. Lightning struck twice and so forth. Knife in the heart? Clover shook her head. Those dishy policemen would never understand. Suppose you're right. Gregory shook his head. There's no getting away from it. Work. We'll have to bury him. The point is where. There was a long silence. Then Clover bounced with excitement. There's one safe place, under the rockery. Gregory slapped his thigh. I say, what a jolly good idea. He loved that bally old rockery, and what with all those bricks on top of him, he'll be safe as houses. I'm sure he would have wished it, Clover remarked sentimentally. Gregory helped himself to a drink. Clover almost frowned. Well, hadn't you better get on with it? What, now? Well, I certainly don't want him left where he is. The dinner's spoiling. But all that snow. And those rocks and things. Well, it's a bit much, especially on Christmas Day." It took 3 hours to dismantle the rockery, another 2 before a 3-feet-deep hole had been carved out of the frost-hard ground. Then Gregory rebelled. "Damned if I'm going down an inch more. My belly back's aching. I'm frozen and starving." "But don't you think—" Clover began. "No. He goes in, ready or not. I'll shovel the dirt back in, pile the rocks on top, and call it a day. I bet the selfish blighter wouldn't have done as much for me." By 5 o'clock he was back in Arthur's chair, looking cold and worn out, but wearing the expression of a man who considers he has done a difficult job well. "Snowing again," he announced. "That'll cover him up very nicely." "Gregory," Clover's face was marred by a troubled expression, "how are we going to explain his absence?" "Well, say he left you. Went off and left you. Sort of thing he would do. Fellow was a cad." "But the money," she complained. "How do we get the money? We must prove he's dead." "Oh, gosh, you're right." Gregory sat upright. "Damnation, there's always something. What the hell are we going to do?" "His first wife's body was never found," Clover remarked thoughtfully. "What?" They found the car on a cliff near Chalmouth, the car and a pair of her knickers." "You don't say." "I mean, I could always say he never got over the death of his first wife," Clover suggested, "always fretting, despite all I did to make him forget. He actually took me to the cliff top on our honeymoon. Well, I could easily find it again." "Gosh, what a perfectly super idea!" Gregory exclaimed. "An absolute corker." "We'll leave the car on top of the cliff," Clover said, "and a pair of his long underpants." The coroner poured out his sympathy in a generous stream. His imagery was reminiscent of the hunting field and farmyard. "Indeed, it can be said, there is no love like the old love. Here was a man who tried so hard to recover from the shock of losing, in such tragic circumstances, the cornerstone, or may I so put it, the very foundation of his life. He remarried a young and beautiful woman, hoping, doubtlessly, to take up the reins and ride hard along the road of life, but alas, the roots were too deep, the obstacles too high for his mount to clear, while the ditches were too wide. His hand could not grasp the scythe, his plough overturned, and he fell into the compost heap of despondency. I would like to tender my deep sympathy for the young widow, and express my hope that she will find happiness in the not-too-far-distant future." Clover took him at his word. She married Gregory at a registry office the following week, and took her new husband down to Brighton for a short honeymoon. When they returned to the cottage, the snow had gone, and the grass was a yard high. "Get a bloke in to cut it, as soon as you get the money," Gregory told Clover. "Don't feel up to it myself." Clover was in a position to sign her own cheques about 2 months later, and they engaged the services of a Mr. Jenkins, who came up from the village armed with a scythe and a rip-hook. "Fine old job there," he remarked, staring thoughtfully at the miniature jungle. "Rare old thirsty work that's going to be." Gregory poured him a pint of beer, and, suitably lubricated, Mr. Jenkins went forth to reap. First, he cut a broad path round the edge of the garden, and the warm air was scented with the smell of new-mown hay. Under the old elm tree he paused, laid down his scythe, and examined the exposed ground with intense concentration. Gregory, who had been watching from a safe distance, called out, "What is it, Mr. Jenkins?" Mr. Jenkins took his hat off, and, bending down, deposited a number of small objects into it. He then trotted back along the path his scythe had created, and approached Gregory with much shaking of the head and clucking of the tongue. "Look here, sir, I never did see the like of this in all me born days." He held out his upturned hat for Gregory's inspection. In it lay a pile of perhaps 24 or more grey-white objects, bearing more than a passing resemblance to tiny clenched fists. Each one was about the size of a golf ball, the minute fingers shut tight, the little thumbs sticking out at an angle. They were most realistic, almost as if a large fist had gone to seed. "What on earth are they?" Gregory asked, glancing anxiously at the weed-shrouded rockery. "I reckon," Mr. Jenkins stated, "they must be some kind of mushrooms. See, they're all soft and pappy. I expect they got all twisted when they growed, you see. With your permission, sir, I'd like to take 'em home and get me missus to fry some with butter. I'll give some to me old rooster, and if he's still standing in the morning, well, then I'll have 'em with a slice of bacon and a fried egg. Well, unless you fancy 'em yourself, sir." No, thanks." Gregory shook his head. "You're welcome." Mr. Jenkins went back to his work, and some 10 minutes later he arrived at the apple tree. Again he paused. "Come over here, if you would, sir." "What now?" Gregory ambled over the cut grass, and came at length to the tree, where he found Mr. Jenkins on his knees, examining a crop of yellowish growths that covered an area of some square feet. "Well, darn me if there ain't more. Only look. These uns look like little fingers and thumbs. Well, damn me breeches if some of 'em don't look uncommonly like big toes. Well, I'm jiggered." "Going to fry those?" Gregory asked. "No, they look a bit too unusual to eat. I was thinking they'd look well if I was to plant 'em between me dahlias, you see. Make a nice spread and a bit of a border." "Well, you're welcome to them. Please do take all you can find." "Thank you kindly, sir." Gregory walked back to the house and his dinner. Mr. Jenkins took up his rip-hook and approached the rockery. "Little fingers, thumbs, big toes?" Clover inquired. "How strange. You don't suppose—" "Now keep your hair on, old girl," Gregory admonished, spearing a boiled potato on his fork. "Some sort of mushroom. Old Jenkins is talking about eating them." "How ghastly." Clover yawned. "I'm getting so bored. I think we ought to go away for a few days." "Dash it all, girl, we've only just got back. I say, what was that?" It was a yell. Such a cry as might have come from a man who has mistaken a venomous snake for a piece of old rope, or met himself coming downstairs. It was repeated, only now it was more high-pitched, shrill, and there came the sound of running footsteps intermingled with rasping sobs. "What the hell?" Gregory rose and ran out into the garden, almost crashing into Mr. Jenkins, who was positively galloping towards the front gate. He stopped, pointed a shaking finger at Gregory, and poured out a torrent of words. "Thought it was a bloody cabbage, I did. Bloody yellow cabbage. Gonna cut it, I was. Gonna tell 'em. I'm gonna tell 'em, I will. I'll tell 'em. Bloody mouth open. The other. Oh, my God." He turned and ran, with a speed that should have been impossible for a man of his age, through the open gateway, and Gregory heard his heavy footsteps receding rapidly down the lane. "Gregory?" Clover was gripping his arm. "Do you suppose—" "Well, we must find out," he said. "We have to go there." He nodded in the direction of the rockery. "We must find out." "Well, I don't want to," Clover wailed. "We must," he said. "We must." They moved forward as if weighed down with heavy chains, and it seemed, at least to Gregory, that they were walking a grass-strewn path to hell. The rockery was shaved clean of weeds, dock-leaves, and grass. The rocks and half-bricks stood out in the sunlight like mountains on the moon. Then they saw what crowded the ugly pile, and Clover gave a muffled scream. "No!" Gregory shook his head. "It's not possible." The head that poked out of the top of the rockery was yellow, not unlike a cabbage at first glance. The cheeks had fallen in, the eyes had gone, the mouth was gaping, the hair was a matted, earth-caked mop, rather like an uncompleted bird's nest, but it was still recognizable. Arthur had come up from the depths. Gregory moved slowly round the rockery and found his cup of horror was yet to be filled. Growing out of the far side was another head, more battered, more time-worn, merely a skull covered with coarse yellow skin. It appeared to be gazing up at Arthur's head, and a soft breeze shook the dangling mass of grey hair, creating the impression of grotesque movement, as if it still begrudged the 2 feet of earth or so that separated them. Clover's screams were a wild symphony of terror that made the birds rise from the surrounding trees and go teeming up into the cloudless sky like an army of lost souls endeavoring to escape from Hades. Gregory, too, thought of flight, but he knew there could be no hiding place, and he suddenly wished he was safely back in childhood, writing his name on a clean sheet of paper. He moved forward and gazed up at Archer's dead face. "Why?" he asked. The awful features wore an expression of terror that was a reflection of his own.